It is a little past midnight on the 25th of May, 1944, in a three-story brick building on MacArthur Boulevard in Montgomery County, Maryland, painted over in patches of green and brown so that from the air it disappears into the tree line. Inside, the lights never go out. Rows of young women bend over drafting tables, tracing contour lines from stereoscopic photographs with the concentration of surgeons. Down the corridor, offset lithographic presses thunder through the night shift, stacking sheet after sheet of a French coastline that most of the women printing it have never seen and will never be told the name of. They know it only as a grid reference. The building is called the Ruth Building, named for an engineer who has been dead for over a decade, and officially it does not exist. Officially, the organization working inside it is simply the Army Map Service. Unofficially, within a fortnight, the maps rolling off these presses will be tucked into the map cases of men wading ashore on beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Not one of the women on that night shift knows the date the invasion will actually begin. Fewer still know the names of the beaches themselves. That knowledge is compartmentalized so tightly that entire departments work from grid squares and reference numbers rather than place names, a precaution against exactly the kind of catastrophic leak that could unravel months of planning in a single careless sentence. And yet the work itself leaves nothing to chance. Every hedgerow, every drainage ditch, every farmhouse wall strong enough to shelter a machine gun has to be there, rendered in exact scale, because the men who will carry these sheets ashore will have no opportunity to improvise if the paper is wrong. By the time the presses finally stop for Operation Overlord, they will have produced 3,000 different maps and printed 70 million individual copies. Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall was built to stop an army. It could not stop a filing cabinet the size of a nation, and it certainly could not stop the women of Arlington and their lithographic stones. This is the story of how the United States, a country that entered the war with barely a working topographic survey of its own coastline, built the largest map-making operation the world had ever seen, and quietly turned paper into one of the decisive weapons of the invasion of Europe. To understand why 70 million maps mattered, it helps to understand just how little the American military had to work with in December 1941. The United States Army's peacetime mapping arm, the Engineer Reproduction Plant, was a modest lithographic workshop with a handful of staff built for the intermittent needs of a small, largely home-based force. It had never been asked to map a continent it had never visited, let alone several continents simultaneously. When war came, American planners discovered that huge tracts of the earth relevant to their operations existed on paper only as vague, outdated colonial surveys, tourist guides, or nothing at all. General George S. Patton would later claim, not entirely in jest, that he planned parts of the Third Army's advance across France using a Michelin road map bought for motorists, supplemented by his own instinct for terrain that armored vehicles could cross. Beneath the wit lies a genuinely alarming truth. For long stretches of the war, commanders were working with civilian road atlases because military-grade alternatives simply did not exist. North Africa was scarcely better served, its French colonial surveys patchy and often decades old. The Pacific theater was worse again, some islands mapped only by missionaries' sketches or whaling charts from the previous century. Meanwhile, the scale of what was being asked for kept multiplying. A single amphibious landing did not need one map. It needed beach gradient charts for the landing craft, tidal and hydrographic data for the Navy, road and rail networks for the follow-on armor, target overlays for the artillery, and evacuation routes for the wounded, each printed in the thousands, each needing to be accurate to a matter of yards, and each needing to exist in the hands of the right unit before a single boot touched sand. Getting this wrong did not mean an inconvenience. It meant landing craft grounding on sandbars that were not on the chart, tanks bogging in marshland the map had shown as firm pasture, and artillery falling short or long because the contour lines were guesswork. Early in the war, precisely these kinds of failures did happen. Small disasters born of thin intelligence rather than enemy fire, and they were noted quietly and with growing alarm by planners who understood that the tempo of the war was only going to accelerate. Every additional theater the United States entered multiplied the problem rather than adding to it in a simple, linear way. A landing in North Africa demanded one entire library of terrain data. A subsequent campaign in Sicily demanded another, unrelated to the first. A projected invasion of northern France demanded a third, of a scale and precision beyond anything attempted before, because the margin for error on a heavily defended, fortified coastline was measured in feet rather than miles. The problem, in short, was not simply that America needed maps. It was that America needed more accurate maps of more of the Earth's surface, faster than any cartographic organization in history had ever been required to produce them. And it needed to do so from a standing start, with a workforce that had, in large part, not yet been recruited, trained, or even identified. The answer took shape at the Army Map Service, formed in 1942 by fusing the old Engineer Reproduction Plant with the War Department's Cartographic Library and General Staff Mapping Section, and it took shape, crucially, on an industrial rather than an artisanal model. The AMS treated cartography less like a craft and more like a production line, operating around the clock 6 days a week, with each map passing through compilation, drafting, color separation, plate making, and printing in sequence, much as a car might move down an assembly line at a Detroit plant. At its technical heart lay stereophotogrammetry, a method of turning overlapping pairs of aerial photographs into precise, three-dimensional terrain data. Reconnaissance aircraft, often flying perilously low and slow over enemy coastline, would photograph the same stretch of ground twice from slightly different angles. Viewed together through an optical instrument called a multiplex stereo plotter, roughly the size of a large sewing machine, those two flat photographs would suddenly appear to rise into a three-dimensional model, allowing a trained operator to trace contour lines directly from what was, in effect, a photographic illusion of solid ground. For the invasion of Normandy, this technique fed into a secret project codenamed Benson, drawing on aerial photography, captured French survey data, pre-war Michelin sheets, hydrographic soundings, and even seaside picture postcards and holiday photographs solicited from members of the public who had once visited the Normandy coast, all cross-referenced by the Inter-Service Topographical Department working out of Manchester College, Oxford, in close partnership with the AMS. The finished compilation was then handed to drafters, who by 1944 numbered several thousand, a great many of them women. The Army Map Service, its male cartographers steadily drained away into uniform, had turned to American universities to solve its staffing crisis, and the University of Chicago's Geography Department designed a course in military cartography that spread to colleges across the East and Midwest. In its first year alone, some 200 women completed the course. Within a further year, the program had expanded to 22 colleges and universities, feeding a steady pipeline of new recruits into Arlington. Roughly 224 of the earliest cohort found themselves posted directly to the Ruth Building, commuting by trolley from temporary barracks housing and later from purpose-built civil service apartments at McLean Gardens, working shifts of up to 70 hours a week, drafting, editing, and color-separating maps under a project name that stuck, the Military Mapping Maidens, or simply the 3M Girls. Each finished sheet typically required several distinct printing plates, one for every color, so that roads, contours, vegetation, water, and text could each be laid down separately and in precise register, a process demanding a level of manual accuracy not unlike hand-setting type for a newspaper, repeated for every single one of the 40,000 distinct map designs the service would eventually produce. Their finished plates fed into lithographic presses capable of turning out tens of thousands of identical sheets in a single working day, the paper stock chosen and treated specifically to survive folding, soaking, and rough handling in a soldier's kit. Each sheet folded, packed, and trucked to depots for onward shipment, at a rate the pre-war Engineer Reproduction Plant, with its handful of staff and peacetime workload, could not have matched in a decade. The maps produced at Arlington and at sister facilities that grew up around it were not abstractions. In North Africa, roughly 1,000 different map sheets, 10 million printed copies in total, guided the torch landings and the subsequent advance towards Tunisia across terrain almost entirely unfamiliar to American forces. Much of it compiled in weeks rather than the months such work would normally have demanded. In the Pacific, island charts compiled from fragments of pre-war Japanese mandate surveys, missionary sketches, and fresh aerial photography helped Marines plan assaults on atolls barely large enough to appear clearly on a standard map projection. Coral reefs and tidal flats picked out in painstaking detail because a single misjudged lagoon depth could strand an entire wave of landing craft short of the beach. And in Normandy, the 70 million sheets produced for Overlord reached down to extraordinary levels of tactical detail, showing individual hedgerows, farm buildings, and the precise gradient of beach exits that combat engineers would need to identify within minutes of landing. Soldiers who stormed those beaches on the 6th of June carried waterproofed map sections in their assault jackets, memorizing crossroads and church spires from photographs and drawings of a country most of them had never set foot in, briefed by officers who could point to features on paper that the men would not see with their own eyes until the ramps went down. Exactly how many individual decisions, how many lives turned on the accuracy of a single contour line is not something the historical record can quantify with any precision, and no serious historian claims otherwise. What can be said is that commanders across every theater, from Eisenhower's headquarters down to individual company commanders, repeatedly cited reliable mapping as a precondition for operations they would otherwise have refused to attempt, and that where the record does survive in unit diaries and after-action reports, it speaks again and again of maps that matched the ground almost exactly, a small, unglamorous kind of confidence that few of the men carrying them ever thought to question until decades later, when historians began asking where those maps had actually come from. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this story still to come. Germany, by contrast, entered the war with an excellent cartographic tradition and steadily lost the capacity to use it. The Wehrmacht's survey and mapping detachments, the Vermessungs- und Kartenabteilungen, were staffed by skilled professional cartographers and, in the war's opening campaigns, produced work of real sophistication. But German mapping labored under two compounding disadvantages that American planners, arriving late to the war, were largely spared. First, much of it depended on republishing and adapting existing surveys, including British Ordnance Survey sheets and Admiralty charts seized or copied wherever possible, rather than generating fresh wartime accurate terrain data at anything like American volume. Second, Germany was fighting a two-front, then multi-front war of attrition that steadily drained skilled personnel and industrial capacity away from cartographic support and towards the front line itself. The result shows plainly in surviving German situation maps of the Eastern Front, which frequently depict battle lines as a single continuous curve, when the reality on the ground was of gaps, screens, and thinly held sectors that Soviet planners exploited ruthlessly. Where the Army Map Service could put 3,000 different purpose-built sheets into soldiers' hands for a single invasion, German commanders further east were, by 1944, often working from situation maps redrawn twice daily under mounting pressure, patched together rather than freshly surveyed. The comparison is not simply one of national character or technical genius. It is a comparison of industrial capacity, of a country that could spare hundreds of trained women for detailed peacetime standard cartography against a country that increasingly could not spare anyone from the front. British mapmaking, through the Inter-Service Topographical Department and the War Office's Geographical Section, General Staff, remained excellent throughout and indeed fed directly into the American effort for Overlord, but Britain lacked the sheer printing capacity to match American output alone. It was the combination, British intelligence and photographic sourcing married to American industrial-scale reproduction, that made a project like Benson possible at all, and it was a combination the Axis powers, fighting on multiple fronts with shrinking resources, were never able to replicate. Assessing the precise military impact of any single map or any single cartographic decision is inherently difficult, because a map's success is measured by the disasters it silently prevented rather than by anything that appears in an after-action report. What is not in dispute is the scale of the achievement and its psychological weight for the men who relied on it. Roughly 500 million individual map copies were produced by the Army Map Service between 1941 and 1945, covering some 400,000 square miles of the Earth's surface across 40,000 distinct map designs, an output that, together with British and Allied production, has been estimated at close to 1 billion sheets in total by the war's end. That is an industrial achievement to rank alongside the mass production of tanks or aircraft, produced not on a factory floor of heavy machinery, but very largely at drafting tables by young women recruited straight from university geography departments who had, in most cases, never held a security clearance before, and who worked in a camouflaged building most of their own families had no idea existed. Many of those women stayed in cartography and federal service long after the guns fell silent, some quietly becoming pioneers of the still young profession of photogrammetric mapping at a time when few other technical careers were open to them at all. The techniques pioneered at the Ruth Building, particularly the marriage of stereophotogrammetry with rapid offset lithography, fed directly into post-war military mapping standards agreed between the United States, Britain, and Canada between 1949 and 1951, standards that were subsequently extended across NATO and remain, in modified form, part of the DNA of military and civilian geospatial intelligence today. The Army Map Service itself evolved through several name changes and mergers into the Defense Mapping Agency and ultimately into what is now the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, an organization whose satellite imagery and digital terrain models are the direct technological descendants of those hand-inked contour lines. Surviving Overlord-era sheets, along with photographs and testimony of the military mapping maidens, can today be found in the collections of the United States National Archives, the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division, and University Map Libraries from Texas to Buffalo, quiet paper witnesses to a project that, at the time, barely a handful of people were permitted to see in full, and whose full scale was not widely appreciated by the public for decades after the war ended. Return, for a moment, to that brick building on MacArthur Boulevard in the small hours of a May morning in 1944. The presses are still running. Somewhere in that building, a young woman not yet 25 years old is tracing, with a fine pen, the exact curve of a hedgerow outside a French farmhouse she will never visit, for men she will never meet, ahead of a battle she is not permitted to know the date of. Multiply her by several thousand. Multiply that hedgerow by every lane, church spire, seawall, and drainage ditch along 60 miles of Norman coastline. That is what 70 million maps actually means. It does not mean paper. It means every soldier stepping off a landing craft into unfamiliar fire, carrying in his jacket pocket a stranger's careful, patient work, translated from an aerial photograph into a line he could trust with his life. Germany had spent 4 years building concrete gun emplacements, steel obstacles, and minefields to stop an invasion it knew was coming, an Atlantic wall engineered to break an army on the sand. Every calculation the German High Command made about the coming assault concerned steel, concrete, and manpower. Guns that could be counted, bunkers that could be surveyed, divisions that could be numbered and positioned along a coastline they believed they understood better than anyone. What it could not build a wall against was information, delivered in such precise, overwhelming volume that the invaders often knew the ground better, on paper, than some of the defenders knew it in person. No amount of reinforced concrete could compensate for a headquarters working from outdated, hastily annotated situation maps, while the men coming ashore against them carried freshly printed sheets accurate down to the width of a hedgerow. The war was won with tanks, with aircraft, with the extraordinary courage of the men who crossed those beaches under fire, and no map ever fired a shot or held a line. But behind almost every one of those decisions, someone, somewhere, had already drawn the ground first, quietly, methodically, for months beforehand, in a camouflaged building whose name most of them will never learn. Germany prepared for an army. What actually arrived, folded into thousands of map cases and printed 70 million times over, was something Berlin never fully accounted for. An entire country's worth of paper, precision, and patience, arriving on the tide a full step ahead of the guns. The concrete held its ground for a matter of hours. The maps outlasted it by decades, and in a sense, they are still with us, in the surveying standards that shaped NATO, in the satellites that succeeded the stereoplotter, and in the quiet, largely unrecorded triumph of several thousand young women who were asked to draw a war they could not fight, and who drew it well enough that an army 8,000 kilometers from home could land on a beach it had never seen and somehow already know exactly where it was going.